Hello, everybody, and welcome to In Conversation Live. I'm sorry we're a tiny bit late. We had a few technical hitches here. Well, this evening, we're very pleased to say that we have Helena Kennedy, Baroness Kennedy of the Shores, who is, of course, a Scottish barrister, a famous broadcaster, Labour member of the House of Lords. She served as principal of Mansfield College, Oxford, and she's now Chancellor of Sheffield Hallam University. Hi, Helena. I'm sorry that we had a little technical hitch there. It's lovely to see you.
Really lovely to see you, Roger.
Great.
You've become a broadcaster now. You've become the broadcaster now.
Well, I know you've had a big experience of that. I've been looking at your career all day today, and you've done some fantastic things, absolutely amazing things. But let's start with your most recent thing, which we're all, as a surgeon and being married to another surgeon who we briefly saw when we were trying to get the Wi-Fi working and so on. You've just done this report at the Royal College of Surgeons of England, which has kind of sent shockwaves through the surgical establishment, but I think in a sort of positive way. Can you just talk us through that report? And I think it was Neil Mortensen, our current president there, whose idea it was. It was really a brilliant idea, wasn't it? So just tell us a little bit about that.
It really was, Roger. I thought it was also quite a sort of bold thing to do, because undoubtedly it's these things which are about looking internally and perhaps examining some aspects of one's own institutional framework, which may have uncomfortable reading, was something that he knew was not going to be straightforward. And I think it was a really timely thing, but also it was a sign of good leadership that he felt that this was the moment to do this, because there had been, there were signals coming through of a level of unhappiness about feeling that recent elections had brought on, distinguished men, but distinguished white men, and that there wasn't enough diversity and variety in the people who were coming through the organization. And I think he recognized that the organization, the institution of the Royal College, which is a great and wonderful thing, had to really engage better with the changing nature of those who were becoming surgeons and practicing, and the way in which our whole medical framework is changing. So I thought it was very brave of him. He gave me a free hand. He let me put together a panel. And I tried to make it diverse in that but I wanted to hear voices that were people who had experience of feeling that they hadn't had a fair crack at the whip, where there were problems that they identified with. Sometimes those of us who have, who have been, come through the system, we forget what it was like in the early days, and we also forget what it's like for the young, and we also have perhaps never experienced what it's like to be Black, or what it's like to be from an ethnic minority. I think it was an interesting thing for him to do, and I loved doing it. And can I tell you something? Here I am. I'm married to a surgeon. I've always been an admirer of what you all do, but at the same time, I came out with such a high opinion of the medical profession and the dedication and commitment of people who are in the profession, who are surgeons. It was really impressive. So it was a great thing to have had the opportunity of doing.
And then, well, I've read the report, but I think quite a few of our viewers and listeners tonight won't have done so. So just summarize what you think were the most important conclusions, Helena.
Well, I mean, really, it was stimulated by the fact that, that there were complaints from members of the ethnic minority communities, from women, about the way in which they experienced their lives in the profession. And so the recommendations that we were making was that, we really had to have much greater diversity in the leadership of organizations. That people have to see people like themselves in order to feel this is a place where I want to belong and I want to give my time to sustain it into the future. And that requires creating avenues in, being much more embracing of the young and people who are different. We had terrible stories of people just feeling that they went along to things at the Royal College and that they hadn't felt included. We heard stories of women feeling that there was a sort of serious, masculinity about the whole thing, and that sometimes their participation didn't seem that welcome. And people, of course, who belong to something often don't see the ways in which it can be intimidating and off-putting to others. So we took evidence. I mean, I didn't want to reinvent the wheel. There's a lot of stuff out there which is about, the ways in which ethnic minorities experience the National Health Service working in it. There were bodies of material that one could rely on. So we went to that. We harnessed all of the material that already existed. I had a panel of senior surgeons. I had Bernie Ribeiro, who'd been a president. I took evidence from Claire Marks, who, of course, it was the first and only woman president. Bernie Ribeiro, the only Black president has been, or person from a minority.
Lord Ribeiro, he's one of my teachers when I was at medical school, actually. Fantastic.
A great man and a great colleague of mine in the House of Lords. And then we had the young, and we had people who were involved in surgeons in training, and we had wonderful Black women surgeons, and we had, of course, the wonderful woman who's established the Women in Surgery, many years ago. So we had that was Avril Mansfield. So we had a great gathering of people to rely on. Then we spent time gathering evidence by way of, we did a survey of opinions. We gathered stories and accounts from people about their experiences. And we tried to draw on that in order to build up a picture of how the profession perhaps is, and how unwittingly it can feel very off-putting. And I wanted it to be saying that the Royal College of Surgeons is the professional home of surgeons, and it should feel like a professional home, and you should feel like somebody who, that's a place that where you're welcome, where you're going to develop your capacity, that it's got opportunities for you to be mentored and so on. And one of the things, of course, is that change takes place in other bits of the medical world, and the impact on professionalism. And so the old idea of the firm, and probably, Roger, when you were young, you were in one of those firms, whether a senior consultant like you are now, I mean, they bring on the young, and they then become mentors to them as they go through their professional life. Well, that doesn't work in that way anymore. And the sort of reshaping of the profession has meant that those sorts of ties and links for professional development and a sense of professionalism are being eroded. And so we made recommendations about the many ways in which we could, revitalize professionalism, a sense of professionalism, and revitalize the great pieces of this puzzle that develop and hold that professionalism together. And that has to be inclusive, and it has to mean that women can feel comfortable being in there, that there has to be clear avenues in for the young, and that people from ethnic minorities are welcome too. And I'm afraid that I'd love to encourage people to go and have a look at the report, because it's really by hearing the stories and the pain that goes with. If you're a Black person and you in your daily round feel that you're patronized, or you feel that your voice isn't listened to, and women talk about this as well. And of course, in Black women, there's a way in which there can be discriminations which are what's called nowadays intersectional. Where if you're Black and you're a woman, the constant references to you in your daily round of assuming that you're, a cleaner or somebody's assistant or something happens in the law too. So my experience as a lawyer and in a profession that's very similar to the surgical profession, in that it was an area. The bar is an area of law which was always sort of for the upper middle classes and upper middle class men mainly. And so it's had to change, and it's had to evolve, and it's had to take some kicking to get it there. And so sometimes you have to say the painful things in order to move things on. Now the surgical profession is like that too. It really is. It is a really vital and precious part of the medical you know, fraternity, but it can't be a fraternity. It has to widen its arms, include women more, make sure that the opportunities are there. And that has to deal with the very obvious things of the ways in which having a family life has to be accommodated. One of the strong recommendations was that there really had to be some work done by the Royal College on how do you deal with parenthood? Because, you know, young men now too want to be much more engaged with their children, and we see that all around us. I see it with my own children. They, you know, they want to be involved with their families too, and so you have to somehow find ways to make the profession work satisfactorily for that. Mm-hmm. But there are lots of recommendations. There are ways in which we can challenge, you know, change electoral systems. We have to make people make all the bits of the profession, because of course there are all the specialisms, and automatically those specialisms have representation on the council. And too often it was just a sort of automatic thing that somebody was tapped on the shoulder and it would, you know, they would go up to be the representative of the different bits of the surgical world. And you know, I'm afraid it was same old, and that's not to be in any way discrediting of the good people who give their time. But you have to really find ways of enriching that and bringing in other voices. But you know, I mean, look at the world just now. I mean, I've done work on this, of course, within my own profession, and arguing for the importance of women and people from ethnic minorities being in the judiciary, because it creates a public confidence and trust. And the health service is in a similar position. You need to have trust from the general public. And it helps if you have people bringing their knowledge and experience of all the different communities into the medical world. And it means that we all then learn from each other about where there might be problems, what might work better. And I always point out that, you know, it's kind of interesting that the two leading people who were working on AstraZeneca were women. And, you know, the women are, you know, the two people who developed the Pfizer vaccine, they were immigrants to Germany. You know, we need the enrichment of the other. And, you know, McKinsey in the business world has done great reports on this. The companies see a huge increase in their profitability when they have the diversity in their boards and in their leadership, because it brings in new knowledge. It strikes up, you know, those things kindle new thinking. And so actually there's benefits for everybody in doing this. So this is not about political correctness. This is about, you know, I mean, people want to dismiss this and say, you know, and there are also people who are in minorities. I mean, you know, there are also who say, I've never had a problem. Well, good luck, that's great, I'm glad for you, but it's not true for everybody, I can tell you. And there are women who will say, you know, I don't know what this is all about, you know, and I've never had the experience of anybody talking down to me or anybody sexually harassing me. Well, lucky you, because I don't know many women who haven't had those experiences in any professional life. And so we've got to move on, and the world is changing, and the medical world has to go with it too.
The feedback I'm getting from my surgical pals is that you're absolutely nailed this, but I've got a couple of questions for you. These are my own. There's some questions coming through, so we'll come on to those. I mean, the first question is, how do you make sure that your report doesn't get put on a shelf and gather dust? How is it, do you make sure that it's actually implemented? That's number one. Number two is, if this applies to surgeons are traditionally the most conservative of the medical profession. They're the ones who still wear three-piece suits and half-moon glasses and so on. But do you think that all the other specialties, which of course vastly outnumber surgeons, anaesthetists, pathologists, et cetera, do you think the same problem applies to them? And how do we get your very important messages just to one college? How do we disseminate them to across the whole profession?
The truth is, Roger, is I'm being invited all the time now to speak to not only the different professional surgical associations and at their annual meetings and so on, and taking those opportunities. But I'm also being invited by the other Royal Colleges who are working on this too. I mean, you know, it's not just the medical world. You know, it's happening in the look at these discussions are taking place about Parliament and having to be more representative, about the BBC, about all of our world, a sense in which if you really are going to have a society where opportunities are there for everybody, then you have to have a mind to this. Mm-hmm. And so, yes, of course, the surgical profession is, particularly, I think, it has a great history, and change is more difficult in institutions which have that longevity and which have that grandeur. But the bar is exactly the same, and the judiciary too. And so what you have to do is you have to keep pushing this uphill and keep revisiting it. Now, when I did a report for the Royal College of Pathologists, it was at the time when they some women were convicted of having murdered their babies. Yeah. And it was around the issue of cot death. And so I did, in the parlance of the tabloid papers, cot death, but it was, it was sudden infant death. And after the convictions had been quashed, there was an inquiry for the Royal College of Pathologists and the Royal College of Pediatrics. And we came together with the two colleges, and I chaired this, and we created a report about learning the lessons. How do we take this forward? How can we have better protocols for dealing with what had gone wrong? And then 10 years later, we revisited it. What's gone on? What's happened? Has there been movement? So, I'll come back knocking on your door in 10 years' time and say, what have you done and how has it gone? So I do think you have to just keep monitoring these things. You can't let it be. You have to keep doing a review. How is this going? And of course, I've got a time frame on it. I put a time limit on it, which is before when we've got sort of 5-year limit, a window of 4 to 5 years, and we've got to make a big difference in how.
I like the targets that you put on, strict targets on, for example, having at least one woman vice president. Yeah. As an obligatory thing, because I think. And there is a risk with these things that everybody says, "Oh, it's a good idea," but things don't really change. But I thought the conclusions were terrific, and we'll definitely put the whole report on the website, so the view can check that up. Let's go back a little bit in time, because you have this amazing career, but you've always been on the side of the underprivileged and the underdog, the defender of the underdog, we could call you. Helena, and that, I guess, that reflects a bit your own background. We had Dame Carol Black on this program 3 or 4 weeks ago now, with a rather similar background. You sort of fought your way in. I thought there were so many interesting stories. I also listened to your Desert Island Discs recording from 1988, wow. I think it was. Yeah. You haven't changed at all, by the way.
Oh, really? I've gone golden with age.
Yes, absolutely. Well, we both have. But you're the same era as me. So we lived through the 70s as in London as a junior doctor, and you a junior lawyer. And it was a different world then. We had the female eunuch there. That was the beginning of the kind of revolution of feminism, of women's liberation, they called it in those days. Yeah, you must have had a bit of a hard time at the bar, didn't you? Just talk us a little bit through that.
It was so interesting. When you tell young women about this now, they really find it hard to believe. Yeah. But I went to the bar, of course, in the 70s, and at that time there were only 6% of practitioners were women, and so it was a. Sets of chambers would say, we don't take women, and we don't take women here. And they didn't blink in saying it. And then, of course, the Sex Discrimination Act came in 76. And then they would say, women, we've got one. And so they kind of started moving very slowly towards what they thought was, an acceptable thing. But it was really very grudging. And so it was very hard for me. I came from and I've always been very open about it. I've come from a working class background in Glasgow. I was kind of clever at school. I was encouraged by good teachers who really, wanted things for me. And my parents wanted things for me too, although they were a bit frightened about me going off to London and thought it was a den of iniquity. But I came down to London because when I was in, sort of from 16 onwards, I used to come down. I had an older sister who was married and had children and was living in the outskirts of London. And I came down and got summer jobs. And so I became rather kind of tantalized by the business of London. And I also, it was a very radical time. Of course, there were lots of things going on about being anti the Vietnam War and about wanting, a different kind of world. And so I wanted to come to London and study, and I came down to do law. And really, that was because I was in the debating society. Scotland's big on debating, and I sort of enjoyed the business of the argument. And so I thought that I would use law. My father was a trade unionist. He was a dispatch hand in the newspaper world. I mean, a very a job which was not a skilled job. I mean, he was actually a clever man. Just they hadn't had opportunities. But he was a trade unionist, and people used to have accidents and things at work. And, it was very hard to get compensated or anything. And so I thought I would become a trade union lawyer. And I came down, and I ended up studying law here, and I went to the Inns of Court School of Law. I actually had wanted to go to the London School of Economics, but I'd left it too late to apply. And I met Professor Wedderburn, who was the great trade union lawyer, who was an academic there. And he said, go to the School of Law that's run by the Inns of Court. And I did that, and that was me. I was off and running, and I wanted desperately to practice at the bar. But it was tough, I can tell you. They just, and I didn't have any connections or anything. I had to bludgeon a poor man to make me his pupil. And he said to me, the chambers will give you a hard time. And it was true, I was treated like wallpaper. I would go into the clerk's room to collect his briefs for him, and I'd have to wait much longer than anybody else because they really felt disgruntled that there was a woman in their midst. And so getting started was hard. And so actually, I look back on it now and I still can't believe it, but at 24, with a number of other young lawyers, we set up a new set of chambers. I mean, it's sort of unheard of, but we said, well, if it's going to be difficult to get into sets of chambers because we don't have connections and things, we'll set up our own. And it was 3 men and 3 women. And one of the women was a gay woman, which at that time was, and it was an out gay woman, which at that time was really unheard of, that somebody was openly gay at the bar. And so we set up this little set of chambers, and it was really doing work for the community law centres, for legal aid firms on high streets that did sort of ordinary people's work. So it was, and I started doing criminal civil liberties work, and it went on from there. And there was a lot happening, remember, in the 70s, and there was there was a lot of racist stuff going on, and there was the anti-Nazi League because they used to go on demonstrations because there was the National Front used to do rotten things. There was a lot of that sort of stuff around race. I acted for many men who were pulled into courts because of homosexuality. And although there had been the reform in the law, it hadn't changed in a real sense, and people would be arrested for cottaging and all that stuff. So I was just doing this sort of down and regular work. But then I started doing bigger sort of cases by the end of the 70s. And I was, as you said, I was a feminist. I went to all those meetings. I wanted to understand, because once I started going to court, I started seeing that women sort of were being judged in this strange sort of with this double standard, which was that if they were good women and were, and they had just done a bit of shoplifting or something, then they could be treated with great chivalry, and that was nice. But if they were, somebody who was in any way not playing by the rule book as to what society expected of women, then they were in serious trouble, and the courts were pretty unkind to them. And so I started seeing that, and it started making me interested in how the law didn't deliver well for women. And so I've written about that over my life, and I've done many of the cases, big cases around, violence against women. And now internationally, I do a lot of work on, that element in genocide and in crimes against humanity, where women, it was one of those buried things in war and in conflict, the way in which women would be raped in a massive you know, in incredible ways. I mean, even in the Second World War, we now know about it, but it was a source of shame that women couldn't speak of what had been done to them, because you would become somehow contaminated in some way and unworthy, and perhaps not that, you know, it would affect how your husband might see you or what your marriage chances were. So people didn't talk about what happened to them. And I see this now in the Congo, in the Iraq, Syria situation, or just now recently in Rohingya, but also the Uyghur in China. The women get raped and abused in the most horrifying ways. So I've done a lot of work around women stuff, but I did a lot on terrorism, and a lot was happening politically, and I ended up doing a lot of difficult cases.
You were involved defending the Irish. The Guildford Four was quite a famous case of yours, wasn't it? Because there was a lot of anti-Irish sentiment in the times when the bombs were going off in England, a lot of prejudice against Irish people, which seems to have subsided now. But in those days, it was very bad, wasn't it?
It was a difficult time. And there is an interesting thing. I mean, for me as a lawyer, there have been a number of things, and you've said about acting for the underdog. It's about acting for those where you feel that actually securing justice may have an additional challenge in it because of the strength of public feeling about the nature of the crime. And so you've got to try and drive that out of the courtroom to say, you know, yes, the crime here is horrifying. What we have to make sure is that when in examining the evidence, that we're not allowing our feelings about the crime to interfere with our judgment about whether the evidence actually fulfills the standards for conviction. Because sometimes it would be, you know, somebody's brother was hauled into the court because of association and but not being involved, or wives or whatever. I mean, we've seen that also recently, sometimes in the more recent terrorist trials that I did. I mean, I haven't done them so recently, but I did the transatlantic bomb plot with the Islamic terrorists, and those cases too, you know, there are serious bad guys at the center, but around the edge of it, there are people who get drawn in who are really sometimes, you know, need a different kind of, you know, the case has to be considered because sometimes they're really not guilty. So I've had a very interesting life in the law and tried to reform the law in ways, and sometimes with success and sometimes not. But and now, you know, a point comes in your life, and I suppose it's true for all of us, where you start sort of trying to, you know, harvest the things you learned in order to look at the bigger picture and how that might translate into change on a bigger platform.
Quite a few questions coming in on medico-legal issues, and we had Bertie Lee on this program a few weeks ago, very controversial character, and we've got James Badenoch in a few weeks from now, so we will focus on that issue. But before we do, you talked about reformation, and you're in the House of Lords, and it seems to me, as an observer from the outside, that is an organisation that could do with a bit of reformation. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, first of all, it's been a strange time during COVID, because most of our work is now done virtually. But the idea is that from September, we're going to be back in the House again. But a small, you know, a minority of people who perhaps have ill health or physical disabilities will be able to apply to do it virtually. So the virtual element that we've learned will be introduced in. But that has really had a rotten impact, because, you know, the vitality of debate it goes when you are having to do it all virtually. But, you know, there's just too many people. I mean, you know, it's you know, too many people are being appointed to the House of Lords. So some of us older ones are going to have to sort of put a time limit on it and say that we'll go. But of course, you know, I also, you know, do love the work that I do there. I mean, I sit on I don't just go in for the chat. I sit on the select committee on justice and home affairs. And so we take issues and we really take evidence on them and try to develop better law and so on. So there is a lot of work done that you don't see. And so it's not just, you know, having tea in fancy old tea rooms and you think
it will be reformed? I mean, Tony Blair, I think, wanted to reform it, and Nick Clegg as well, desperately. Yeah. But you know, they've been thwarted, haven't they?
Roger, it's very difficult because, of course, prime ministers of all complexions, you know, it's not confined to one party. They quite like the fact that they've got something to use as a kind of hook to say to people, do you think you might retire, Charlie, and move up to the House of Lords so that your seat can go to somebody else when they're wanting to bring a new generation of MPs in or whatever. So, you know, it's one of those things that it gives, it gives those in government something to use, of course. And then you've got the disgraceful stuff where it's used to compensate people who've given large donations to political parties. So, I mean, there's bad stuff, undoubtedly. But one of the things that is interesting is that, I mean, you think of Bernie Ribeiro, is that, you know, it does make a difference that if you have people from many different backgrounds, and nowadays, actually, if you were to come into the House of Lords, you would be amazed. You know, there are people from every ethnic background. There are people from so many walks of life. From the grand to the not so grand. It really is interesting to see just how varied the complexion of the House is. But you also get a whole lot of folk who are just there to have a sleep on the benches, you know. So, I mean, and maybe one of those days I'll be there sleeping and somebody should tap me on the shoulders and say, "Your time's up, woman." And, you know, I think that probably there's going to have to be a much tougher thing about people stepping out, making way for younger people and making it much smaller. It should only be a few hundred people. It shouldn't be bigger than the House of Commons as it now is. That's ridiculous.
I think it's about 800 members, aren't there now, the House of Lords?
Let me tell you that 800 don't turn up. They just like the business of having a title.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about medico-legal issues, because I think raw deal, there's a question from David Cochran. Thank you, David, for that. What are your thoughts on solutions of medico-legal issues? Because it worries a lot of, not just surgeons, but like your husband and like me, but a lot of clinicians now feel hampered or alarmed by the prospect of litigation against them. Yeah. About that.
I made a program years ago, and I would really like it to be revisited. It was a program for the BBC, and it was called Raw Deal, and it was looking at having, you know, basically finding a way of not having litigation, and you know what the program showed was that when people, and this was then though, and I don't know whether culturally we as a society have changed, because I do think that money has moved much more centrally into our value system, that, you know, that's become, you know, the great value in a way that I don't think it should be. But when I was making that program about not using the courts as the method, but actually having compensation that was just, you know, that people were compensated if something went wrong, but not trying to put sort of, you know, guilt on the head of somebody, that was unnecessary, that doctors learn from mistakes. We all learn from our mistakes, and there isn't in any profession that none of us can put our hands on our hearts and say that we haven't got things wrong at times. And so the idea of being sued and the threat of litigation is a terrible burden to have hanging over you. And it's really had a horrible effect on the creation of defensive medicine in the United States. And so I'm really for serious reform of that. And I think it would be very good to have some kind of commission that looked at a way of dealing with this, because it's crippling the National Health Service. I mean, nobody talks about the cost it is to hospital trusts of paying out when something has happened. And of course, in many ways, people want to hear what's happened, an explanation. They want somebody to sit down with them and say, "I'm so sorry about what happened," and explaining it to them. And doctors, of course, are immediately advised not to do that. Yeah. And so I think there has to be another way. And I'm a firm believer that no fault liability, you know, I'm in favor of reviewing the whole system. I mean, there'll be plenty of medical negligence lawyers who'll be resisting that because they make a lot of money out of doing it. But we really have to stop doing it. So I'm for reform.
Okay, well, we will be discussing that later in the series with James Badenoch and so on. But let's go back to some other aspects of your career. I mean, you're an author of those two books, which are really, really interesting. Eve Was Framed, and then later Eve Was Shamed. Kind of, I think Eve Was Framed was republished too. And also, you've been a broadcaster on the TV. A famous interview with Oliver Reed I was reading about, which sounds rather terrible man.
It was a terrible moment because he got terribly drunk on this program. It was after dark, and he sort of went out and probably drank more, and then came back in again. And Kate Millett, the famous American radical feminist, was there, who's a gay woman and so on. And he got hold of her face, and he, you know, I won't describe it in detail, his behavior, but he basically sexually assaulted her on the screen. And so suddenly the screen had to go dark, and then we came back again. I had to say to him, Oliver, I sounded like Miss Jean Brodie. You can hear this Scottish voice saying, Oliver, that was unacceptable behavior. I sound like a Scottish school mistress, and I'd ask him to leave. And he then, like a little schoolboy, put his head down and said, "Oh, I didn't mean any harm." Anyway, it was one of those television moments that haunts me.
But yeah, your latest book then, Eve Was Shamed, How British Justice is Failing Women. Of course, you know, that plays into what we're already talking about. But cases like the murder on of the lady kidnapped on Clapham Common just kind of feeds into that element, doesn't it? And so we're not out of the situation where women are at risk. If anything, it might be worse. And globally, probably, as you just said, it's a massive problem.
And we're not helped by the internet. You know, the way in which social media really can be such a blight on the lives of young women. You know, telling them, you know, all the time about how they're supposed to look and that they don't look good, and giving them negative feelings about themselves, and then the ways in which they're trolled and abused online, and then of course the availability of porn to kids when they're so young, so that young men are learning that, you know, a wholly distorted way of thinking about sexual intimacy. And so, you know, is it any wonder that we've got the problems just now around all of this stuff? And so I do think that that the whole business of social media and the internet has been both a great benefit, like we're using it tonight, but also a terrible blight on lives, and affecting our societies and our democracies in serious ways.
It's interesting on this program, you know, we get YouTube views afterwards, but the YouTube views of the program that's far outweighed the others, 1 million views, was Lord Sumption saying that really COVID's not such a big problem, and that mainly elderly people died. The sort of messages that really the opposite that you want to get out there. So, I mean, the trouble is social media amplifies anti-vax, it amplifies, you know, the wrong things that you want to emphasize. Yeah. Social media seems to have the opposite effect. So, yeah, that's really, really, really interesting. So you've got some children of your own. Are they in the legal profession, medical profession, or nothing at all to do with?
They have actually, well, my daughter has followed her father. Right. She resisted it for a while, and she did a degree in anthropology, but then she started drifting. She did a master's in medical anthropology, and then it became very clear to her that she wanted to be a doctor. So she's a young, at the moment doing surgical training. And her husband is a doctor. So, you know, we're doing our bit by the medical profession. Not one of them has wanted to do law. So there we are.
We should give your husband a plug, because he does this amazing facial surgery at St. Bartholomew's, good old Ian. And he's also formed a charity, hasn't he, like yourself. You've got the Helena Kennedy Foundation, which I think that gives grants to people who really need help in getting into education. Is that right?
Yeah, it was. I was asked back in the early 90s to mid 90s by Gillian Shepherd, who was then the Conservative Education Secretary of State. She's a terrific woman. She's a great friend. And she, I mean now, but I didn't know particularly then, but she knew that I was sat on some education commissions. And she asked me to look at the business of further education. And I did a report on that. And I've always liked doing other things. I always think it makes you, I mean, it's made me better as a lawyer because I learn so much from other people in other professions. And so I learned that further education is basically the Cinderella of our education world. It's where people often catch up on having, you know, schooling not having worked out for them, you know, girls that got pregnant at 15 or boys who got into bits of trouble and so on, or folk who basically, where their families weren't, you know, supportive with regard to education. Then suddenly they're in their 20s or 30s and they want to get back in. But getting, you know, education now is costly. I mean, you have to get the money for fees and so we discovered that the transition for those second chance people, particularly hard, or people who are asylum seekers. And so we started creating bursaries. I mean, I did that with my friend Anne Lim, who is a head of an a further education college, and a wonderful woman. And we put together this thing, and it bore my name really because I had put out at that time a report saying we have to give people second chances in education, retraining opportunities, and so on. And so that's what my little thing does. And so I kind of pester people to raise money, and if I give a speech somewhere and somebody says we'll give something to a charity, then I stick it in the foundation. But we help people who are really disadvantaged to get through education.
Because you've been involved in 3 institutions, haven't you? Oxford Brookes, Sheffield Hallam University, and then the Oxford College as well. So, I mean, looking back in terms of education, where do you think the problems are over there? Is diversity and inclusion, is that better handled in education than it is in medicine?
Oh yeah, I mean, I mean, one of the things is that we've been really, there's been a lot of work gone into, and so even, you know, down in Oxford, there was a lot of hard work going into trying to open up the gates and to be more embracing of kids from, you know, not from fancy schools, you know, and to get the word out, and that there was there was a place at Oxford if you know, if you were clever and you wanted to come. And so but I've also, you know, I've done very different kinds of universities. I mean, Sheffield Hallam, it's a very different kind of university, and it's based up there in in Sheffield, and it does a very different kind of work. And the students who come in are often coming in because they're going to go into nursing, they're going to go into technology, they're going to go into very, very different. Universities are as varied as the numbers of them, but the great thing is you want to be giving opportunities to people, and we've really got to sort of try and get our skills up in the UK. As we are going forward and come out of this pandemic, because I'm worried for our young, because I think they're going to face problems about jobs. You know, we sell them the idea of education and getting a degree, but in my day, of course, it meant that you did have a career in front of you. But for young people now, getting a degree doesn't necessarily mean that anymore. Mm-hmm. And the jobs are just not there in numbers. And I think that we've really got to you know, the problems for our young are about we're burdening them with debt. We've made it impossible for them to get onto the mortgage ladders. And I see this even for young doctors, young surgeons. You know, if you're in the big cities, you know, getting started in London's impossible. And so we've got to start looking at inequity but making our society just fairer for people and creating more opportunities. Listen, our young are our future. And so, and it's one of the things that happens as you become I'm now a grandparent, and I just want those opportunities to be available, whatever they want to do. And we have to build a society that makes that possible. And we've shrunk our society, I feel, in recent years. And I feel that we've created a bigger chasm between those who've got, you know, are privileged and those who aren't. There is great inequity, and we've got to try to make a better kind of society.
Well, I read, I think it might have been Alistair Campbell that used a phrase that resonated of educational apartheid. You know, our Prime Minister is educated at Eton and Oxford, and so many of the top parliamentarians are, and top doctors, I have to say, as well. So what are your thoughts about public schools? Obviously, they're ancient institutions, you know, they do provide fantastic education, but it gives children such a huge advantage, especially in the post-COVID era where they get everything is given to them and so little is given to so many others.
Well, I'm not a believer, in ending that, because I just think that you can't do that. You have to have societies which are free societies in which people make choices. But I do think you have to. There are responsibilities that come with all these things. It's like the business of the responsibilities of the corporate world. I mean, we spent a whole lot of time getting people to have business degrees, and what we were teaching people in getting them to do business degrees was, profitability is the only consideration, and and it isn't. Companies have to have responsibilities to the planet, to communities, to stakeholders beyond the shareholder. And the same is true about these private schools. I just feel that they have to be doing more in the communities about sharing their facilities and so on. Most state schools don't have any sporting grounds or anything anymore because it was all sold off. Mm-hmm. And so, I was asked to go and speak at Eton. And I went. I'd never seen it. I was quite interested to have a look. And if you were to see the theatre, and it's why we've got so many Etonian wonderful actors at the moment. If you were to see the theatre there, it is as good as any theatre in the West End of London, with the lighting, and professional direction. So you don't have to go to RADA because it's been there available to you. And so, I mean, all I would say is that what's available is chalk and cheese, and we have to start, closing those gaps.
I guess it's an issue of fairness. Well, we mentioned our Prime Minister. I know you've got to go soon because you've got to dash off to a party at 8 o'clock sharp. So I won't keep you longer than that. But I have a feeling that you're an anti-Brexiteer, Helena. Yeah. So, I mean,
I want to say it was very interesting to listen to Dominic Cummings yesterday, where he was saying only an idiot would say that Brexit would say definitely that Brexit was a good thing. I thought, you're the guy that created the kind of slogans that persuaded the world that it was the only thing that would save the nation. I'm now as convinced as I ever was that Brexit was not a good idea. But there may be amongst you people listening who don't agree with me at all. But I believe in international collaboration. I do think that in our world, that being part of an economic bloc is a good thing. Which isn't to say that I wasn't full of criticisms of aspects of Europe. Absolutely, because it's very difficult to create a bloc without it starting to become bound up in bureaucracy. But we could have actually, and I've got my criticism of how this has gone, but I do think that we should have negotiated a different kind of deals. We had a great position with Europe, where we were the only nation that had all these sort of opt-outs and things. I mean, we had an incredible deal by comparison with other places. And the awful thing is that if a point comes where we ever would want to even consider rejoining, all those things would not be available to us. So, I mean, now we're having to scour around the world looking for trading deals. And I'm telling you all that, we're wanting to do business with Saudi Arabia. I just did the Jamal Khashoggi case, where I went out as an expert to Turkey and heard the tapes, the intelligence that the Turkish intelligence had. I was part of the UN team that went out, and I heard that man being murdered. That was done because he was a critic of the Saudi regime. Mm-hmm. And we're running out there, licking their boots, wanting business with them. I'm sorry, but I do think that you have to sort of speak your values. And now we're in a position where instead of doing business with our nearest neighbors, we're having to do even more business with some of the most reprehensible nations in the world when it comes to respect for the human dignity of our fellow human beings.
we're not allowed to take a political stance at the Royal Society of Medicine, so I couldn't possibly comment. But actually, we've got a few more minutes before we let you go. Andrew Harris raises a good question. He's a senior coroner, Andrew Harris. Thank you, Andrew. Should medical manslaughter be reformed? I think he's referring to the famous Selous case. I was a bit involved in that. And I think one of the things that David felt very let down by the Royal College of Surgeons, that they didn't support him. And there was kind of a stony silence there when poor old David went via Belmarsh to. It
was a terrible case. And we heard from David Selous when we were hearing about, we were taking evidence for the diversity and inclusion report. And it was a heartbreaking thing. What that man experienced. And I think there are ways that you can be supportive to colleagues when something like that happens without having to feel, oh, we mustn't be seen to take sides and all of this kind of thing. No, there should have been much greater support, and I think we were disappointed and shocked that he didn't get the support he deserved. But I do think that medical manslaughter should be looked at. And it goes back to that discussion earlier about how I actually do think that the whole area, the whole business of medical negligence and looking for the blame culture is one that we should really be examining and seeing whether we can't do something better there. You know, it really isn't fair. And the interesting thing was, I mean, we do have to also recognize, you know, the questions that arise about the statistics that show, you know, why is it that more people from ethnic minorities end up being people who have accusations made against them, and why that happens. And to some extent, some of that is about, and it was said that there are levels of anxiety that rest for you if you feel that you are under more scrutiny. It's, you know, there are all sorts of things that should be examined there about what produces errors and mistakes. And let me tell you, you'll get more of them with a medical profession that's under pressure. And at the moment, you know, speaking to my young and my daughter and her friends who are in the medical profession, they are feeling very, very pressurized. COVID has been hard on the young.
Yeah, absolutely right. We're almost running out of time. I always ask this question when I interview lovely people like yourself. What are you, of all the things you've done, what would you say you feel most proud of, Helena? I mean, that's a tricky question because you've done so much.
Well, listen, I mean, you know, it's that thing, you know, I suppose really, as a practitioner in the law, I've been, I suppose, noisiest about wanting the law to really acknowledge the fact that law was a product of, you know, it was the nature of our society. The rules were made by men in law, and therefore law often has failed women. And so it certainly, you know, if you go across the piece, it's a huge amount of change has happened in my lifetime. And I do like to, and I hope it can be said that I contributed to that change of getting the law to examine itself and to be a place which looked more to justice than just to law.
That's something to be terribly proud of, but so many other things as well. I better let you go because I know they're going out to a party tonight. So thank you so much.
Roger, you're a great man, and it's been such fun being with you. Sometime I'm going to interrogate you.
Oh my God.
Yes, and get you to talk about all the things you've done.
I'd be worried by being interrogated by a QC. I definitely would. Have a lovely evening, and thank you so much. What an amazing lady she is. Tomorrow we have COVID and ventilation on our ongoing COVID series. Every Thursday at 12:30. We've got our famous Gabrielle Scally is bound to say some controversial things, and we will be looking at the spread of COVID in ventilated buildings, especially as we unlock. Also mention that we finished our climate change series now. We've had 10 amazing programs. We did the last one on Tuesday. You can, if you go to RSM Live, you can see all the previous 10 programs, about an hour each, about climate change, planetary health, and what doctors can do by talking to their colleagues, their patients, and making the NHS greener. I think that's a really important series. So I'd urge you to watch that. I'd remind you that you can become a member of the RSM. You don't have to be a doctor or a dentist or a vet. We'd love to have people interested in medicine join us as associate members. And don't forget that the RSM is under the cosh because of COVID. Our building's closed. So if you would like to make a donation to the RSM, that will be gratefully received. We've actually raised about £160,000 with this series so far. I'm quite proud of that, and I'm so grateful to our generous donors. Now, the final announcement is that on Tuesday, normally we would have the inauguration ceremony for the president of the RSM. I've been a president for a year, but the inauguration ceremony got delayed by 12 months. Unfortunately, because of the rising incidence of corona, we've had to change that from an in-person event. We had 200 people who were due to come to now a smaller number of people with social distance. And we are putting it online. So you can join that if you'd like to see the inauguration ceremony, where I get to wear a medal. And more importantly, the gold medal award to Dame Sarah Gilbert, the inventor of the AstraZeneca vaccine, the lady who got a standing ovation at Wimbledon this year. She'll be saying a few words, and I will be awarding her the gold medal from the RSM. So if you're interested in that, it starts about 6:30 on Tuesday evening, and on Wednesday evening we have Professor Paul Nurth, Nobel Prize winner, for our next In Conversation Live. So you can see that lots of things are going on at the RSM, and we'd love it for you to join us. I'm sorry we haven't had time to ask Helena many of your questions today. She talked rather so coherently. There wasn't really time to get any questions in there, actually. She gave such good answers to the ones I did get in. So good night from me, and hopefully we'll see you at our various events over the next few weeks. Goodbye.